Hi, my name is Teresa Bolger and I'm a consultant archaeologist working with Rubicon Heritage Services. This is the fourth in a series of talks about archaeology in the context of construction projects and development control. Our previous talks outlined what archaeology is, why it's important, and the legal framework for its protection. Then, how archaeology fits into the planning process, and most recently gave an overview of archaeological methods and practice. This talk will focus on risk management, how to manage archaeology as a risk item within the lifetime of a construction project. We conventionally think of risks as negative things, but the project management body of knowledge, often referred to as PMBOK, defines risk as an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives. So, risks in project management terms can be both positive and negative. Sometimes the terms threats and opportunities are used instead of risk to capture this idea of potential positive as well as negative outcomes. The key defining characteristic that unites both the positive and the negative, however, is uncertainty. Risk management in projects is all about defining and understanding the characteristics of each risk item, how it can impact on the project, and putting in place mitigation measures to control and offset the risk. At the start of any construction project, archaeology is a big amorphous ball of uncertainty. In simple project management terms, it is undefined project risk. The process of engaging with and managing that risk effectively should be founded on putting definition to the risk, refining and narrowing its scope and potential impact, so that its effects on the project can be planned for, mitigated and managed. The failure to engage early and often with any archaeological issues is in itself almost a project risk, and one that has a greater potential to be a threat rather than an opportunity. In our previous talks, we have looked at the legal protections and requirements for archaeology, how consideration of archaeology has been hard-coded into our planning system, and the various processes and practices that archaeologists can carry out in relation to construction projects. So we are now going to take that information and reframe it to show how this can be deployed to manage archaeology as a project risk. At this initial stage of a construction or development project, some of the key considerations are the purchase of land. Will it be a suitable site for the kind of project envisioned, or is a land bank investment? How much should be invested in the purchase price? If the land is already acquired, then what could be developed upon it? What broadly do we want to try and build? How can the site's potential be maximised? Now, obviously, archaeology is far from the only consideration at this stage, but some basic assessment of risk should be done. The key thing to establish in terms of archaeology to feed into these feasibility decisions is, are there any constraints to be aware of? What do we mean by constraints? What we're talking about at this point are designated sites within the site boundary, such as RMPs, protected structures, or NIH-listed sites. Designated sites in its immediate proximity, whether upstanding or not. Zones of protection, such as architectural conservation areas or zones of archaeological potential. The presence of a designated site within the potential development site will affect what can or cannot be built on that site, how much of the site can be developed, and the types of building that might be suitable. It may be advisable, where this is the case, to consider some professional advice at this stage, whether from an archaeologist or conservation architect, to ensure that options, restrictions, and cost impacts can be evaluated and factored into decision making at this early stage. However, even if there are no designated sites within the subject lands, the presence of designated sites in the immediate proximity or proximity to zones of protection can indicate a potential for unknown subsurface archaeology to be present. This might not preclude development, but since it would result in planning conditions, identifying this as a specific risk at this stage means that more active planning and management can start at design stage, and potential time and cost implications can be factored into future project planning. Note that if there are upstanding designated sites close by, where the site is within an ACA, then there is potential for any development to have a visual impact, that is, an impact on the setting of these sites. Again, this does not preclude development broadly, but does mean that the approach to development and design may need to be sympathetic to these protected sites or areas. It may rule out certain design options or development types, though. Professional advice would assist in assessing this. Another thing to consider at this stage is overall scale. Even if a site has no obvious risks within the boundary, a larger development site has a greater potential to have unknown subsurface archaeology. This is reflected in planning policies. Most local authorities will request a certain level of archaeological assessment as further information or as a condition of planning for sites above a specific size. It's not something that would have an effect on what could feasibly be built, but it should be factored into the financial project forecasting and planning at this stage as an item of expected future cost. So at this initial stage, the key objective is to establish if there is broadly an archaeological risk attached to a particular site, and getting a very high-level assessment of how this might impact a proposed development project for that site. This is the point at which a development design evolves and a planning application is submitted. This is also the point at which early engagement can really start to pay off in terms of risk management. If the kind of high-level review I've already outlined at feasibility stage hasn't occurred, then it really should take place now. If any potential for an archaeological risk is identified, then professional advice should be sought. An archaeologist or conservation architect, depending on the character of the potential risk, should ideally be included within the design team. So how do we start to define and refine our understanding of the potential risk? First off, if we have very clear specific risks emerging, clear potential for impacts to a designated site or sites, for example, then the archaeologist or conservation architect can work with the design team to advise on effective design solutions. Approaches that will protect the relevant designated sites and are consistent with current best practice and monument protection policies. They can also assist in opening initial dialogues with the relevant regulators to ensure that any emerging design is potentially acceptable in terms of archaeological or architectural heritage protection. A proper desk-based impact assessment at this design stage will put initial definition to any archaeological risk items that might attach to the development of a proposed site. Depending on the character of these emerging risks, this assessment process might recommend additional works to further define the scope of these archaeological risks to reduce the uncertainty. The two most common approaches to this are geophysical survey and/or archaeological test trenching. The nature of the risks we are trying to define in conjunction with the character of the site being assessed will determine what the optimal approaches are. While it is preferable that these kinds of more detailed study, where needed, should occur at this stage, it may not always be possible. Access to sites may be limited. A good example of this is certain urban sites where demolition of existing buildings may be needed before archaeological test trenching is feasible. Obviously, this cannot occur prior to a grant of planning permission. Archaeological monitoring of any geotechnical site investigations at this stage can also provide useful information on the extent and character of archaeological risks. The aim at this stage is to define the broad character of the archaeological risk and the broad character of the potential impacts, to provide an opportunity to reduce, mitigate and manage those impacts through the evolution of the design to its final form, to allow informed design decisions to be made where these might affect the character and magnitude of potential impacts to archaeology, and thus the complexity of the archaeological issues and risks that will be carried forward to the construction stages. The outcome should be a detailed archaeological impact assessment report that can accompany the planning application. This report should set out the known archaeological risks, the remaining areas of uncertainty as to the character of those risks, any necessary action to reduce that uncertainty, any reductions to or avoidance of impacts to archaeology that have been achieved through the design, a structured set of mitigation measures consistent with current best practice to offset and manage any remaining residual impacts to archaeology during pre-construction and construction phases. At this point, a grant of planning permission has been obtained. This grant will have conditions, including those relating to archaeology. Some of these conditions will require action prior to construction occurring. There may also be necessary enabling works that have to be completed before the main construction programme can commence. For many projects, this may be the first point at which there is any formal engagement with archaeological risk, often only triggered by the attachment of conditions to the planning permission. Proper professional advice from an archaeologist is now essential. At this stage, options of avoidance or minimisation of impacts to archaeology through design may no longer be an option. You may now be locked into risk management strategies that require extensive archaeological works with all attendant costs. But achieving better definition of any archaeological risks at this stage can at least create an opportunity to resolve those risks where possible as a separate phase of work prior to construction, or where this is not possible, to allow for adequate planning for any archaeological works that must be delivered during the construction programme. This reduces the potential for secondary effects to cost and programme. Where a project has already engaged with archaeological risk during the previous stages, there should be a roadmap, the mitigation measures defined during design stage, that will set out the necessary actions at this point and continuing into the construction stage where needed. In general, where a comprehensive mitigation strategy has accompanied the planning application, this will be mirrored in the conditions attached to the grant of planning. However, as the planning authority can amend or override any proposed mitigations, the conditions must always be reviewed to ensure that implementation of the mitigation measures fully complies. Where a project has not had this engagement, then the processes for defining and understanding the character of the archaeological risks that I've already outlined need to be compacted into this phase of the project. So the kind of initial actions to define and manage archaeological risk at this stage should include an appropriate combination of desk-based assessment and prospection, such as geophysical survey and test trenching, where this has not already occurred. This will establish if there are unavoidable impacts to archaeology and if archaeological excavation, preservation by record, is needed. If the evaluation work has already been done at design stage, then it's possible to jump straight to dealing with any requirement for archaeological excavation or similar interventions. If it has been clearly established that archaeological excavation is needed, then it should ideally be commissioned and completed at this pre-construction stage. The evaluation work should provide enough information for the required archaeological excavation to be properly scoped and costed for. This can then be carried out as a standalone exercise separate to the construction programme. The ideal outcome we are looking for at the end of this stage of the project, before the site transitions to construction, is a sterilised site where archaeology has been fully de-risked. This can generally be achieved for greenfield sites. But urban projects are more challenging. This is due to two factors. Firstly, access. In many cases, demolition must be completed in order to fully define and/or resolve archaeological risks. This means by default that actions to achieve this have to move to the construction phase. And secondly, the depth of excavation. Many urban sites have deep archaeological stratigraphy, 4 to 6 metres in depth or more, and the planned development can incorporate a basement. As a result, from both a cost and health and safety perspective, integrating the archaeological works into the construction phase becomes unavoidable. However, regardless of this, in approaching risk management of archaeology, the aim should always be to minimise the amount of archaeological work and uncertainty that carries forward to the construction phase. We are now moving to the stage where construction works are commencing on site. If at all possible, the site should have been de-risked for archaeology by this point. If it has not been possible, then the various evaluation processes should have been used at earlier stages to define what risks still need to be dealt with during construction. Careful planning for archaeology at this stage is critical, as the potential for secondary effects to programme and cost can be much more extensive. The aim should be to have a clear and informed set of works requirements in relation to archaeology, in the same way as for any other task items within the construction programme. What needs to be done, how long it should take, and where it fits into the sequence of works. Where an archaeological excavation is required, this should be blocked out as a clear subphase within the project plan with a timeline and appropriate contingencies. The previous evaluation processes should provide the necessary scoping information. However, one thing that may be required during the groundworks phase is archaeological monitoring, and this is a special case. There are three main paths that can lead to archaeological monitoring at construction stage. The first is residual. In this case, the project has been through the full assessment process I've already outlined, and possibly even had some level of archaeological excavation or similar intervention. The purpose of archaeological monitoring here is purely precautionary and/or for the purposes of supervising a minimum impact design, where there is archaeology in situ and construction works must avoid it as per an agreed plan. There is no expectation of any significant discoveries that could require further archaeological work to resolve. While there is still a little uncertainty and risk attached to this, it should be small and manageable. The second case is unavoidable. This is for sites or projects where full, comprehensive evaluation was not possible. A typical example of this would be urban infrastructure projects within the live streetscape. In these instances, it must be understood that archaeological risks have not been fully defined prior to construction, though some non-intrusive assessment may have taken place. There should be an expectation of archaeological discoveries during the construction phase, and allowances for this should be factored into construction planning and costing. Note, non-intrusive assessment methods at design and pre-construction phase can provide some limited definition to the scale and character of the risks for these types of projects. And finally, there is monitoring by default. This is where no evaluation has been carried out at design stage, and the planning permission includes a condition specifying archaeological monitoring. Such conditions are normally triggered either due to the size or scale of the development or its proximity to known archaeological sites. It is not uncommon when such conditions are applied for the developer to carry out no follow-up risk assessment and simply proceed to archaeological monitoring at construction stage. This is a very high-risk strategy. No clear definition of any sort has been put to the character and scale of archaeological risk prior to construction commencing. So it remains a big ball of uncertainty. Archaeological monitoring in such circumstances can result in very substantive discoveries of unknown archaeological features. This can then lead not only to unplanned costs in relation to the resolution of such archaeological features, but also secondary effects from delays to the construction programme and replanning of construction works on the fly. This approach to archaeological risk management is not recommended, as it is divisive and costly. It can be avoided by engaging with the potential archaeological risks much earlier, at least at the pre-construction stage. The monitoring condition does not preclude the carrying out of an impact assessment or prospection such as geophysics or testing prior to construction, so as to provide some level of definition to the archaeological risk. This allows for any significant archaeological discoveries to be made and resolved before construction commences. Taking this approach means that even if archaeological monitoring is still required during groundworks, it is carried out more on a residual risk basis. So, as you can see, while it is not possible to eliminate archaeology as a construction risk in all circumstances, there are well-established processes and practices that, if applied correctly and at the right time, can control and limit the impact and ensure successful delivery of a development project. So in this talk, we have outlined key issues for managing archaeology as a risk item in construction projects. Please check back again soon for more talks in this series. Our previous 3 talks, firstly outlining what archaeology is, why it's considered important and the legislation protecting it, secondly, looking at archaeology in the planning process, and thirdly, giving an overview of archaeological methods and practice, are available for you to watch. Upcoming talks will look at archaeology and construction contracts and outline what is involved in post-excavation analysis and why it is a critical part of the archaeological process. If you want to find out more about risk management, there is a list of links to further resources on our blog post for this talk.